Former Capitol Hill Chief of Police Stephen's son testified in front of Congress, and he's confirming what many of us have said for a long time. Nancy Pelosi was really responsible for January 6th. She was the senior official to whom the Sergeant-at-Arms from the House of Representatives reported. And the House of Representatives Sergeant-at-Arms, Paul Irving, was the guy who got a bunch of phone calls from Stephen's son to bring in the National Guard. But as we're going to hear, Stephen's son tells us it took 71 minutes for that approval to happen, despite making dozens of phone calls. Calling. Nobody's answering, in my opinion, because they wanted it all to happen. And they, as per usual, project, and so they blame Trump for sitting around on his big fat butt in whatever room he was in, watching the news, eating lunch or whatever. Here, they were doing exactly that. It was their House of Representatives, their Senate chamber. They had responsibility for protecting the building. They let it fail. Capitol Hill Chief of Police, former Stephen's son, was testifying, and I'd encourage you to really support his efforts by considering to buy his book, Courage Under Fire. We'll revisit that here at the end. But this is what the Capitol Hill Chief of Police said when he testified in front of Congress. And I want to get this queued up so we don't miss anything. At 16:35 is when his statement starts.
That you please wrap up, as that indicates your 5 minutes has expired. I now recognize Chief Son for 5 minutes.
Former Chief of Police on January 6th.
Chairman Loudermilk, Ranking Member Torres, and members of the subcommittee. It is hard to believe that it has been almost 3 years since January 6th, and we are still having congressional hearings to identify what contributed to that tragic day. To date, there have been 4 congressional reports, along with several Inspector General and Government Accountability Office reports, and they continue to support what many of us have suspected from the very beginning. January 6th was an intelligence failure. We rely on accurate intelligence to help us develop effective security and operational plans. Accurate intelligence is an essential factor in the decision-making process of the Capitol Police Board, and the oversight committees. We now know that significant intelligence existed, that individuals were plotting to storm the Capitol building, target lawmakers, and discussing shooting my officers. And yet no intel agencies or units sounded the alarm. We were blindsided. Intelligence failed operations.
Why is that? The FBI had dozens, if not hundreds, of informants. They had informants with the Proud Boys. Why did they not notify the Capitol Police about this?
The January 6th attack at the Capitol was preventable. If the intelligence had been accurately reported and the FBI and DHS had followed their policies and established practices, I wouldn't be sitting here today. There was a failure to connect the dots on 9/11 and again on January 6th. I'm concerned if we do not identify and correct these issues, we may fail again in the future. I did everything I could to protect and defend the U.S. Capitol and the members of Congress prior to and on January 3rd. Prior to January 6th and prior to and on January 6th. On January 3rd, I requested the assistance of the National Guard to support my perimeter and was denied by the 2 Sergeant-at-Arms over the concern for politics and optics. Still concerned for the number of personnel I had on my perimeter, I called the MPD earlier on the morning of January 6th and asked if they could stage additional personnel closer to the Capitol on Constitution Avenue. Less than 2 hours later, we were violently attacked on the west front of the Capitol at 12:53 p.m. I immediately followed up on that morning call and contacted MPD Chief Carroll at 12:55 p.m. and requested those resources. MPD was on the scene within minutes and were assisting my officers in holding the line and delaying the breach of the building. It took 81 agonizing minutes for that mob to fight their way through numerous police lines before they were able to breach the Capitol. The decision to reach out to MPD proved critical in safeguarding the members of Congress. Minutes after the attack began, I made my first call to House Sergeant-at-Arms Paul Irving at 12:58 p.m. to request approval to bring in the National Guard. Let me run it up the chain, and I will get back to you, was his response. It would be 71 minutes before that approval would finally come. Between 12:58 and when I finally received approval for the National Guard at 2:09 p.m., I made 32 calls to coordinate support from my officers, including at least 11 frustrating calls to the Sergeant-at-Arms regarding my request for the National Guard. My calls to my partner law enforcement agencies resulted in hundreds of police officers from around the National Capital Region and as far away as New Jersey responding to assist. After I received approval to call in the National Guard, I then had to beg the Pentagon officials to send us help. I was repeatedly denied assistance by the Army Lieutenant General Pyatt, citing concerns over optics of the National Guard on Capitol Hill.
More optics.
The D.C. National Guard, many of whom were standing within eyesight of the Capitol, and whose motto is Capitol Guardians, would not arrive until almost 6 p.m. after the fighting was over and the Capitol.
They loved the optics. They loved what they were seeing. They wanted those optics. The optics of a secure Capitol with nothing going on was not what they wanted.
Ground secured. The New Jersey State Police arrived before they did. To add insult to injury, the Inspector General for the Department of Defense considered the response, quote, appropriate. Besides the MPD, the National Guard was the next largest cadre of personnel that could be deployed to assist my officers. We desperately needed those boots on the ground. The fact that the Chief of Police, responsible for the entire entire legislative branch of government was repeatedly denied assistance by the Pentagon is indefensible.
Insane.
The
It's
fact
insane.
that an experienced law enforcement official was constrained by federal law from bringing in life-saving resources for his officers is unfathomable.
It's insane.
This type of politicized control over
It's
and
intentional.
oversight was and continues to be detrimental to the mission. Why bring in an experienced police chief if you're not going to allow him to do his job? In December 2021, Congress amended 2 U.S.C. 1970, the law that restricted my ability to bring in federal resources. While the amendment now grants the chief authority to call in federal resources only during an emergency, it does not grant the chief authority to request federal resources in advance of an event, which means the request can still be denied. In other words, the law still requires the chief to seek advance approval from the Capitol Police Board and congressional leadership. This is exactly what I faced on January 3rd. It should also be noted that the new amendment makes the chief emergency authorization revocable. I'm extremely proud and appreciative of the Capitol Police officers, the Metropolitan Police Department, and the other law enforcement agencies that came to our assistance. Despite bureaucratic issues on the Hill and a no-show by the military, it was law enforcement that saved the day, and not a single member of Congress was injured. Thanks to the assisting law enforcement, the men and women of the Capitol Police did not fail in their mission. In conclusion, I ask that this committee address the institutional failures that contributed to January 6th. I also implore the committee to have an independent entity investigate the complaints and allegations of retaliation against intel whistleblowers following January 6th, and to review any of the personnel actions, to include disciplinary actions that occurred following January 6th, to ensure they were properly investigated and not subject to any inappropriate actions, coercion, influences, or predetermined outcomes. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, great opening statement from Stephen Sund, the former Capitol Hill chief of police. And as we heard him say, he made a phone call to Sergeant at Arms of the House, Paul Irving, at 12:58 p.m. Made 11 phone calls, finally got approval 71 minutes later, walked us through the timeline, saying, I need help. Okay, you can picture this man scrambling all over the place, trying to muster support, going to the people who gives him permission to do that, to the Pentagon, to the Sergeant at Arms. They're all stalling him out. They're all saying sorry, right? He is the hub in the middle of the wheel. All these people are the spokes. He's trying to get them all to communicate, and they're all just hitting the FU button on the phone. So he can't get any support at all. And what we see is after those 11 calls, finally they grant some approval. It takes them hours later to show up, and finally they show up. Most of the things are already over. Now, Sund obviously has been made to be the scapegoat of this, and they asked for his resignation immediately after all of this occurred. This is what Nancy Pelosi said during the aftermath of January, and she was brought in, and listen to this. This is wild to watch in hindsight, because she's now going to be blaming Stephen Sund, right? The whole thing has already been set up, but the question that she gets lobbed here is about the Sergeant at Arms. So she just defers right on past that, okay? Skips right over the Sergeant at Arms, the person who would have approved some support, goes right to Sund.
Security breaches here. Chuck Schumer's talking about firing the Sergeant at Arms over there. Are you thinking of a similar step over here? What are you going to do to address the security breaches on the Capitol?
Well, let me just say that is a very important question. Let me hold for a moment. We have to do the after-action review. I have...
What?
I am calling for the resignation of the Chief of the Capitol Police, Mr. Sund, and I have received notice from Mr. Irving that he will be submitting his resignation.
Okay, so the guy who was calling for help and the guy who was ignored, they asked for his resignation. Pelosi asked for it, Paul Irving asked for it, and they just make him the scapegoat. They start to exit him immediately.
Having said that, we have the after-action review, but it goes beyond the Capitol Police. It goes to the FBI. What was the shortcoming in their intelligence that they provided? It goes...
They didn't provide anything. Stephen Sund just told us they didn't provide anything. They knew a ton of this because they had guys like Kenny Lizardo who were hanging out with Enrique Tarrio, picking him up from jail. Okay, they had informants all over the place. In the Proud Boys trial, the defense attorneys estimated there were as many as 50 informants, and we didn't know much about them because many of them were not a part of the FBI at all. In fact, they put them over to be a part of DHS, Homeland Security Intelligence, whatever agency that was. So you just couldn't identify the people.
It goes to the Department of Defense. How long did it take for them to respond or anticipate the need for the National Guard? It goes to many other elements of the executive branch, and I think we have to have a full review. But let me just say this. Many of our Capitol Police just acted so bravely and so with such concern for the staff, for the members, for the Capitol.
But not Stephen Sund. He's got to go.
Many of them,
because he has all the inside info about your corruption.
But there was a failure of leadership at the top of the Capitol Police.
No, it was the
And I
Senate
think
Sergeant
Mr.
at Arms.
He hasn't even called us since this happened. So
Okay, did you hear that? He hasn't even called us. He didn't even call? We have another segment coming up. Stephen Sun's going to respond to that.
I had made it aware that I would be saying that we're calling for his resignation. Now, in that score, getting back to what was underestimated, that the President of the United States would not be as insightful.
Trump.
Perhaps somebody thought for a moment that he would be patriotic before he leaves office for just this once. So again,
You guys set him
the
up.
fact that these people were incited. And you know what? Last night, I don't know if you heard on the floor, but some of the Republicans in their enabling of the president's bad behavior have said those were not Trumpite. They were Antifa invading the Capitol.
Yeah.
Disguised as Trumpite.
Yeah.
Right. So
And feds.
we have a problem here.
And feds, guys
with
like
the
Ray Epps.
enabling that is going on with the Republicans in the Congress
Yeah.
as well. And undermining the election, again, enabling the president. And if they don't recognize what yesterday was, a threshold was
Scolding.
crossed of such magnitude that there is no way that this president should be allowed to make any decision to rouse any troops of his Trumpite.
Trump was still in office, right?
What's next? What happens today?
We got to stop him.
Who knows?
We got to get rid of
But
him.
we do know that he must be contained.
He must be contained, right? The intelligence op was in effect, and that's what they used to bring in the second impeachment and to try to stop him, let's say, from pardoning Snowden or from pardoning Julian Assange or from doing anything else. They had leverage on him because they've instigated the January 6th attacks. And so there's another clip. Now, Pelosi just got done telling us that she never even got a phone call from Stephen Sund. It was very rude. You know, you'd think that the Capitol Hill chief of police would just make a phone call, for crying out loud. Let's see if that's true.
For being here today. Members of the committee and Congress are thankful for your prior service to the U.S. Capitol Police and your commitment to protecting members, staff, and visitors. My priority as chairman of the Committee on House Administration is to depoliticize Capitol Police. I'm committed to ensuring the U.S. Capitol Police has the tools, resources, and leadership it needs to keep our community safe. I also remain committed to supporting our law enforcement officers and the work they do each day. Today, we're here to discuss the security failures that occurred on January 6, 2021, and how we can prevent these failures from occurring again. I want to dive into the questions, Chief Sund. In your transcribed interview, you mentioned that you met with the House Sergeant at Arms regarding the National Guard prior to January 6th. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And who was the House Sergeant at Arms leading up to and on January 6th?
That would be Paul Irving.
And the House Sergeant at Arms is appointed by who?
It was appointed that time by Speaker Pelosi.
And in your transcribed interview, you mentioned that when you first brought up the National Guard to the House Sergeant at Arms in the days leading up to January 6th, that Mr. Irving said he, quote, didn't like the optics, end quote. Is that correct?
That is correct. He referenced being concerned for optics.
And on January 6th, when you went to Mr. Irving to get his approval to call in the Guard, Mr. Irving said he would, quote, run it up the chain. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That was a telephone call. I didn't see him in person when I first made that request.
The House Sergeant at Arms is considered probably the most senior security official on the House side. When Mr. Irving says he has to, quote, run it up the chain, end quote, what did that mean?
Took that to mean his leadership chain.
Who is that?
And who would be his leadership chain? He's functionally the most senior security official on the House side, correct?
That's his title. That's part of the title, the senior law enforcement official for the House of Representatives. But he would have been referring to the leadership team that goes up to Speaker Pelosi.
So the political leadership team, meaning elected officials, not another security official, is that?
That is correct, sir. He's the top security official for the House.
Okay.
So running up the chain would most likely, in your opinion, is through the Speaker's office and possibly to Speaker Pelosi?
That would be where it ends, yes.
Yep.
Okay, so let's park that there, and then let's jump to a second set here. In a press conference on January 7th, Speaker Pelosi called for your resignation on national television. Speaker Pelosi also stated that she had not talked to you since the initial breach of the Capitol. But according to your transcribed interview, you were on the phone with Speaker Pelosi a few times. Can you explain that discrepancy?
That is correct. I spoke to Speaker Pelosi 3 times that evening, and she went on national TV and said I'd never spoken to her, but I spoke to her 3 times. The 3 times were the first time when I went over to brief Vice President Pence at the secure location. I'd called House Sergeant at Arms Irving, told him I was going over to brief the Vice President. I was also going over to do a personal assessment of the Capitol. At that point, things were getting under control. Went over there, briefed him on when we can get them back into chambers, with Mr. Irving being fully aware. He said he wanted to get Speaker Pelosi on the phone. He made a phone call from his cell phone at approximately 5:34, where I first briefed Speaker Pelosi.
Oh, how about
the second call was when I left that location. As I was walking away, I met up with Mr. Stenger, and we started walking over to the Senate to go brief the Senate. When Jennifer Hemingway, I believe it was Jennifer Hemingway, handed me the cell phone, and it was Emily Barrett's cell phone calling her, and it was Speaker Pelosi on the other line.
On
This
the
is my
phone.
second call with Speaker
Two
Pelosi.
times she's on the
questioning
phone.
the information I'd given to Vice President Pence about when we can get back into chambers. I assured her that information was correct. I could get them back into chambers by 7 p.m., and the call ended. That was call number 2. Call number 3 was 6:25 p.m. I was over at the Senate from the secure location, from where the Senate had been sequestered, and on a cell phone using Robert Karam's cell phone, they dialed leadership, who was over off-site at a secure location, and I briefed all of the leadership of the plans to get them back into chambers. That would have been call number 3 with Speaker Pelosi.
So you didn't have one call, you didn't have 2 calls, you had 3 calls. So Speaker Pelosi's comments that she didn't speak to you are inaccurate.
Lies.
That's correct, sir.
Let me shift gears and
Liars.
go back
She's a liar.
as it relates to the optics of bringing people up to Capitol Hill and running things up the chain of command, ultimately to the Speaker's office. Do you think Speaker Pelosi's office or Speaker Pelosi herself politicized Capitol security?
I have no idea on that, sir.
Okay. Any other clarifications you'd like to make as it relates to Speaker Pelosi's comments that you didn't speak to her?
I just, wish she had considered that, wish she had considered some of the stuff that I faced and the efforts I went through to bring in the outside resources on that day before she called for my resignation.
Thank you very much for being here. I yield back.
Yeah, it would have been nice if she would have been honest with us about it, but she wasn't interested in honesty. She made that man the scapegoat. He called and literally spoke to her 3 times. He's got the receipts for it. He's got the times. He knows who he spoke to. But she went out in front of America and literally lied to everybody. So if she's going to lie about even the phone calls, that means, can you trust anything she says? Her credibility does not exist. Stephen Son ended up resigning, and he has been hammered ever since then. He's one man speaking the truth amongst others. But I'd encourage you to support him, my friends. If you have the means, support him. You can follow him on Twitter. He's also got this book called Courage Under Fire. It's a great book, very factually based, and I think it's quite good. So I'd encourage you to support him. It's one way to show him that you're out there. Stephen Son on Amazon or wherever it is you buy books, Courage Under Fire. And the fire I think he's under now is from the left, from the deep state, from the people who don't want him to tell the truth about the phone calls that he made and about all the things that really happened. So shout out to Stephen Son confirming Pelosi is behind January 6th.